During an M&A, the acquisition price agreed by a buyer and seller might change as transaction timeline shifts. Hence, buyer and seller need to agree on a completion mechanism to determine the final acquisition price that the buyer has to pay. Confused? Let me walk through an example. At the top part of the slide, you will see the timeline from the signing of definitive agreement to actual closing. Once the definitive agreement is executed by the buyer and seller, the two parties will then proceed to satisfy all of the closing conditions to the deal, including regulatory and shareholder approvals, and sourcing the necessary capital to fund and close the transaction. The time when definitive agreement is signed to the satisfaction of all the closing conditions of the deal can take weeks and months apart. The bottom of chart shows a potential problem which both buyer and seller need to consider during the weeks to month period of closing. Think about it. When you sign a definite agreement, the equity value is calculated by deducting the debt, adding excess cash and normalized working capital to enterprise value during the signing date. But the debt, cash and working capital of the company might change from the time of signing till the actual closing date, resulting in a change in equity value. The challenge discussed here of the uncertain price on completion at the time of signing will be resolved by two widely accepted completion mechanisms in M&A transactions, which are lockbox mechanisms or completion accounts. We will cover this in the next slide. In the previous slide, we highlight the challenge of the uncertain price on completion at the time of signing. This can be resolved by two widely accepted completion mechanisms in M&A transactions, which are lockbox mechanisms or completion accounts. The essential difference between the two approaches is one of timing. A lockbox mechanism requires the parties to commit to a certain price at signing, and a completion accounts mechanism commits the parties to a mechanism for determining the certain price at some time following completion. In a locked box, both parties agree that both enterprise value and equity value are locked or fixed at signing. This price is based on the elements of the target company known at that time, often based on interim accounts that have been discussed and agreed between the parties. Simultaneously, the parties agree that the elements used for the determination of the purchase price are locked. The period from the lockbox date to the closing date is called the lockbox period. At the initiative of the acquirer, the vendor often undertakes not to let value leave the target company, such as by extracting cash through issuing a dividend or extracting management fees. Should value, however, leave the target company during the completion period, a leakage is said to have occurred. Typically, parties agree that certain leakage, usually leakage that has occurred outside the vendor's control, is permitted. All other leakage should be reimbursed by the seller to the acquirer at completion on a dollar-for-dollar basis, often on the basis of a reduction of the purchase price. Reversely, value accrual during the completion period can be compensated for by an increase of the purchase price at completion. With completion accounts, only the enterprise value is fixed. The equity value is determined at closing. In a completion account process, the seller prepares an estimated closing balance sheet just before actual closing date. Based on those numbers, the estimated equity value and purchase price is calculated. This estimated preliminary purchase price is paid by buyer to seller, often at signing of the purchase agreement. The purchase agreement includes a time frame within what time the buyer, which is now the new owner, has to provide the final closing balance sheet. Based on the final closing balance sheet, a final equity value is calculated, including final cash, debt and working capital balances. Any differences with the preliminary purchase price paid is either paid by buyer or reimbursed by seller. We highlight here the pros and cons of each of the methods. For locked box, the advantage of the method would be certainty of price of completion, simplicity, and lower cost, as there is no completion accounts to prepare, and management is able to focus on integration post-completion. The downside to the methods include risk of business boom between lockbox date and completion date, which sellers would not benefit from. Additionally, more detailed financial planning and cash flow forecasting are required so that the locked-in price is as accurate as possible. And the method requires earlier planning and preparation to determine the locked-in price. Overall, the lockbox mechanism is generally considered to be seller-friendly, because it provides for price certainty up front, rather than being subject to a post-completion adjustment at a later stage. For completion account, the advantages of employing this method include: there should be no leakages referenced in the SPA, which may speed up negotiations, and the sellers receive the benefit of all profits right up until completion. However, the downside to this method is that it is going to be costly and time-consuming to prepare and agree on the calculations. There are also added complexity in the SPA due to the need to include time frame which the buyer has to provide the final closing balance sheet. This method can result in disputes and delay in agreement of the final price and more risk of price chip. Overall, as the price is less certain at signing compared to lockbox mechanisms, Completion accounts are generally considered to be less seller-friendly. However, if the seller is very confident that the value of the target company will increase during the completion period, this mechanism may be more interesting for him as well.